Hey guys, tonight we travel back to America before 1492, a time when money did not exist and life moved without prices, markets, or numbers. Before you settle in, take a moment, turn off the lights, and simply listen. Enjoy the story as it unfolds, slowly, carefully, like history itself. Imagine, if you will, a map of the world. Now, erase the borders. Erase the highways, the skyscrapers, and the electrical grids that pulse like neon veins across the land. It is the year 1400. You are standing on the edge of the Atlantic, looking inward toward a continent that doesn't yet know the name America. In the modern world, we are defined by having. In 1400, this land was defined by being. To understand life without money, we have to unlearn everything we know about value. Today, if you're hungry, you exchange a digital number or a piece of paper for food. In the 1400s, the distance between your hunger and your meal was measured in sweat, knowledge, and the timing of the seasons. There was no middleman, there was no store. There was only the earth and your relationship with it. Across this vast expanse, from the redwood forests of the west to the humid swamps of the southeast, lived nearly 60 million people. They spoke hundreds of languages, as different from each other as Turkish is from English. They built cities like Cahokia, which at its peak was larger than London. Yet not a single coin ever changed hands. Why? Because in the 1400s, wealth was communal. If the tribe had food, you had food. If the forest was healthy, the people were rich. To hoard more than you could eat was not seen as success. It was seen as a mental illness, a disconnection from the circle of life. In this first chapter of our journey, we aren't just looking at the past, we are looking at a mirror that asks us, what are we when we strip away everything we own? As the sun sets over the Great Plains in our imagination, let us begin to listen to the silence of a continent that was anything but empty. Welcome back. In our first chapter, we stood on the shores of a silent continent. Today, we step deeper into the woods, into the longhouses, and into the minds of the people of the 1400s to answer one question. If there was no gold, no silver, and no paper, how did people buy their survival? In the modern world, money is an object. In 1400s, America, money was a relationship. Let's travel to the northeast, to the land of the Haudenosaunee, whom you might know as the Iroquois. Here they had something called wampum. Now many history books will tell you wampum was just Indian money. But that is a boring oversimplification. Wampum were intricate beads made from white and purple clamshells. To make a single bead required hours of patient grinding with stone tools. But here is the secret. A wampum belt wasn't a wallet. It was a record. It was a story. When you gave wampum to someone, you weren't just paying them. You were giving them your word. You were cementing a treaty, an alliance, or a marriage. If you lied while holding wampum, you weren't just a fraud. You were breaking the spiritual fabric of the universe. Imagine if every time you spent $1, it carried the weight of your entire family's honor. That was the economy of the soul. Now, let's move west, toward the misty coasts of the Pacific Northwest. Here, the Haida and Tlingit peoples practiced something that would make a modern capitalist's head spin, the potlatch. In our world, the person with the most stuff is the most powerful. In a potlatch, the person who gave away the most stuff was the most powerful. A leader would host a massive feast, and then, in front of everyone, they would give away their finest blankets, their best canoes, and their most precious copper shields. Sometimes they would even destroy their possessions to show that their status was so high. They didn't need things to define them. Think about that for a moment. Wealth wasn't measured by what you kept in your basement. It was measured by how much you could afford to lose. The more you gave, the more social credit you earned. In 1400, your bank account was the memory of your neighbours, who remembered your generosity when winter came and the hunt was lean. And then there was the silent trade, the gift economy. In the Great Plains, if a traveller arrived at your tipi, you didn't ask for a credit card. You gave them your best food, not because it was free, but because there was an unspoken law of the land. Today it is you, tomorrow it might be me. This wasn't a world of free stuff. It was a world of intense, beautiful responsibility. Every gift created a debt of kindness. Every trade was a handshake between spirits. As we walk through these ancient trade routes, we realize that the people of the 1400s weren't poor because they lacked coins. They were wealthy because they couldn't imagine a life where they didn't belong to each other. In the silence of the forest, the wind doesn't ask for payment, and in 1400 neither did the people. They simply asked for balance. Welcome back. If part 1 was about the silence of the land, and part 2 was about the spirit of exchange, part 3 is about something the modern world thinks it invented: democracy. Long before the United States had a constitution, long before the French Revolution, there was a league of 6 nations in the woodlands of what we now call New York and Canada. They called themselves the Haudenosaunee, or the People of the Longhouse. You might know them as the Iroquois Confederacy. Imagine a world in the late 1400s where war was constant. Blood feuds lasted generations. But then a vision changed everything. Legend tells of a man known as the Great Peacemaker. He didn't carry a sword, he carried a message of the great law of peace. He travelled in a stone canoe, convincing 5 warring tribes, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, to bury their weapons under a giant white pine tree. They called it the Tree of Peace. But here is where it gets fascinating for our boring history journey. In this society there were no kings, there were no dictators. The power didn't belong to the men with the loudest voices, it belonged to the clan mothers. In the 1400s, while Europe was ruled by kings who claimed a divine right to be tyrants, the Haudenosaunee lived in a matriarchal society. The women owned the longhouses, the women controlled the land, and most importantly, the clan mothers were the ones who chose the leaders, the chiefs. If a chief became greedy, if he stopped listening to the people, or if he showed signs of being a bad human, the clan mothers had the power to dehorn him, to strip him of his title and return him to the rank of a common warrior. Think about the balance of that. A leader wasn't a boss, he was a servant. He was chosen by the wisdom of the grandmothers. And then there was the longhouse itself. These weren't just buildings. They were symbols of their entire political philosophy. A longhouse could be 80 or 100 feet long, covered in elm bark. Inside, dozens of families lived together. There were no locked doors. There were no private rooms. Life was transparent. You ate together, you mourned together, and you decided the future of your nation around a shared fire. The great law of peace was so advanced that it dictated how to speak in a council. You didn't interrupt. You listened until the other person was finished. You thought not just about yourself, but about the 7th generation. Every decision made in the 1400s had to answer one question. How will this affect our descendants 7 generations from now? In our world of quarterly profits and instant gratification, the Haudenosaunee thought in centuries. They didn't need a central bank or a stock market to plan for the future. They used the great law. As we sit by the embers of their fire in our minds, we realize that the 1400s wasn't a primitive time. It was a time of sophisticated political genius. A time when peace wasn't just the absence of war, but the presence of justice. Welcome back. In our previous chapter, we explored the democracy of the woods. Today we travel south to the fertile valleys of the Mississippi River. Here, hidden under the soil of modern-day Illinois, lies a ghost of a city that was once the beating heart of North America. We call it Cahokia. But the truth is, we don't know what the people who lived there called it. They left no books, no letters, no gold coins. They left something much larger. Mountains made of earth. Imagine it is the year 1400. As you paddle your canoe down the river, the trees suddenly part and you see it. A city of 20,000 to 40,000 people. To put that in perspective, in the 1400s this was larger than London or Paris. At the centre of this metropolis stands Monk's Mound, a massive earthen pyramid 10 stories high, containing 22 million cubic feet of soil. Every single basket of that soil was carried by hand. No wheels, no horses, just the collective will of the people. But why build a city out of mud? In our world, we build with steel and glass to show our permanence. In Cahokia, they built with the earth itself to show their connection to it. From the top of Monk's Mound, the great chief, known as the Great Sun, would look down at a perfectly planned urban grid. There were grand plazas for games, residential districts, and even a massive solar calendar that archaeologists today call Woodhenge. Yes, Woodhenge. They drove massive cedar posts into the ground in a perfect circle. When the sun rose on the solstice, it would align perfectly with the poles, telling the people exactly when to plant and when to harvest. They didn't have clocks on their wrists, but they had the entire sky as their timepiece. How did a city this size function without a single dollar?
Cahokia was the Wall Street of the 1400s, but instead of stocks, they traded in meaning. They traded in corn, in salt, and in sacred shells from the Gulf of Mexico. People traveled from thousands of miles away, from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast, just to be part of the Cahokian dream. But life in Cahokia wasn't just about trade. It was about the spectacle. Imagine standing in the Grand Plaza, a space the size of 45 football fields, covered in smooth, pressed clay. Thousands of people are shouting as they watch a game of chunky. A player rolls a stone disc across the ground, and dozens of men sprint after it, throwing spears to where they think the stone will stop. This wasn't just a game. It was a way to settle debts, to prevent wars, and to unify a massive, diverse population. However, as we look at Cahokia in the 1400s, we see a city in its twilight. The forests were being cut down. The soil was tired. The climate was changing. A little ice age was beginning. But there was no bank to bail them out, no government stimulus package. So what did they do? They didn't collapse into chaos. They simply walked away. They chose to leave the city life behind and return to smaller, sustainable communities. They traded the noise of the city for the silence of the prairie. As we stand on top of those silent mounds today, we realize that Cahokia is a warning and a wonder. It proves that humans are capable of building greatness out of nothing but dirt and dreams. It reminds us that a city's true wealth isn't the height of its buildings, but the vision of its people. Close your eyes. Can you hear the echoes of the chunky players? Can you feel the vibration of 40,000 souls singing to the rising sun? This was Cahokia, the city that time forgot, but the earth remembers. Welcome back. After leaving the earthen mounds of Cahokia, we travel thousands of miles west. The air becomes thin, the humidity vanishes, and the horizon turns a deep, fiery red. We are in the high deserts of what we now call the Four Corners, where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. It is the year 1400, and here, the people didn't build mountains out of mud. They carved their destinies into the very bones of the earth. We call them the ancestral Puebloans. Imagine you are standing at the bottom of a massive canyon. You look up hundreds of feet of sheer sandstone, and there, tucked into a giant natural alcove in the cliffside, is a city. A city suspended between heaven and earth. This is Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde. In the 1400s, this was a masterpiece of engineering. These weren't tents or temporary shelters. These were multi-story apartment complexes built with precisely cut stone and mortar. Some buildings had over 150 rooms. To get home, you didn't walk through a front door. You climbed a series of wooden ladders, pulling them up behind you at night for safety. But why live here? In a land where water is more precious than gold, why settle in the heart of a vertical desert? In our modern world, we think of prime real estate as a penthouse in a city. For the Puebloans, prime real estate was a place that offered two things: protection and the sun. These cliff dwellings were designed with a genius understanding of thermodynamics. In the summer, the overhanging rock shaded the houses from the brutal desert heat. In the winter, when the sun hung low in the sky, its rays reached deep into the alcoves, warming the stone walls which acted like natural heaters throughout the cold desert night. They didn't have electricity or HVAC systems, but they lived in perfect harmony with the tilt of the Earth's axis. Without money, the currency of the desert was water. Every drop was sacred. They built intricate check dams and reservoirs to catch the sudden, violent summer rains. Their economy was built on turquoise and corn. Turquoise was the blue of the sky and the water, and it was traded across vast distances, reaching as far south as the Aztec empires in Mexico. But the true heartbeat of the community was the kiva. A kiva is a circular, underground room. It was the spiritual and social lungs of the pueblo. Imagine descending a ladder into the cool, dark earth, away from the desert sun. Here, elders sat around a small fire, weaving blankets of turkey feathers and yucca fiber. They told stories of the kachinas, the spirits of the ancestors and the elements. In the kiva, there was no rank. No one sat higher than anyone else. It was a circle of equality, a place where the soul was recharged. But by 1400, a shadow was falling over these stone cities. A great drought, lasting decades, had gripped the land. The corn was withering. The springs were drying up. In our world, a drought is a financial disaster. For the Puebloans, it was a spiritual sign. They didn't see the desert as failing them. They believed they had finished their time in that place. And so, in one of the most mysterious migrations in history, they began to leave. They didn't leave in a panic. They left carefully. They sealed up their rooms, placed their grinding stones in order, and walked away from the grandest apartments in North America. They moved south, toward the Rio Grande, becoming the ancestors of today's Hopi and Zuni peoples. As we look at the empty windows of Mesa Verde today, we don't see a ruin. We see a testament to a people who knew when to stay, when to build, and most importantly, when to let go die in the desert. Wealth isn't what you build. It's the wisdom to know how to survive when the rain stops. Welcome back. We have climbed the cliff dwellings of the West, and now we descend into the sea of grass. Imagine a landscape so vast that the sky feels like a heavy blue weight pressing down on you. This is the Great Plains in the year 1400. Today, we think of the Plains Indian as a warrior on a galloping horse. But in 1400, there were no horses in America. They wouldn't arrive for another 100 years with the Spanish. So, how did people live in a territory that stretched for thousands of miles, where the wind never stops? They lived by the pulse of the bison. In the 1400s, 60 million bison roamed this land. The earth literally trembled when they moved. To the people of the plains, the ancestors of the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Pawnee, the bison wasn't just an animal. It was a walking department store. It was life itself. Stop button. Without money, the bison was the ultimate provider. Every single part of the animal was used with a reverence that we, in our disposable culture, can hardly imagine. The meat fed the village for months. The hide became the walls of the teepee and the warmth of their beds. The bones became needles and tools. The bladder became a water jug. Even the tail became a fly whisk. Nothing was wasted because wasting a part of the bison was like insulting the creator. But imagine the challenge of hunting a 2,000-pound beast on foot. This required a level of strategic brilliance and communal cooperation that defines the 1400s. They used the buffalo jump. Tribes would work together for days, disguised in wolf skins, slowly steering a massive herd toward the edge of a hidden cliff. It was a dance of life and death, executed with perfect silence. Since there were no horses to carry heavy loads, the people had a silent partner, the dog. In 1400, dogs were the beasts of burden. They pulled a travois, two long poles attached to their backs that dragged along the ground, carrying the folded hides of teepees and the belongings of the family. Life was a constant motion, a rhythmic migration following the grass and the seasons. In this world, wealth wasn't about what you owned, because you had to carry everything you owned. If you had too much stuff, you were slow. And in the plains, slowness meant hunger. So, the wealthiest person was the one who could travel light, but possessed the most knowledge. Who knew where the hidden springs were? Who could read the language of the clouds to predict a blizzard? Who knew the medicinal secrets of the prairie herbs? This was the currency of the plains. There was a profound spirituality in this mobility. When you don't own the land, you belong to it. There were no fences in 1400. No trespassing signs. The land was a gift held in trust for the next generation. As the sun sets over the tall grass prairie, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, we realize that these nomads weren't wandering aimlessly. They were part of a grand, circular journey. They lived in a world where the horizon was never a boundary, but an invitation to eye in the silence between the gusts of wind. You can almost hear the soft padding of moccasins on the earth and the distant lowing of the great herd. A world of movement, before the world stood still. Welcome back. We have traveled through the dry deserts and the windy plains. Now, the air grows heavy with moisture and the scent of salt. We have reached the Pacific Northwest, the land of the Haida, Tlingit, and Salish peoples. If the Great Plains was a world of movement, the Pacific Northwest in the 1400s was a world of massive permanence. Here, nature was so generous that people didn't need to wander. They lived in giant houses made of ancient red cedar trees, some large enough to hold 100 people that eye in our modern economy. We talk about stocks and investments. In the 1400s, the greatest investment in this region was the salmon. Every year, millions of silver salmon would clog the rivers, returning from the ocean to spawn. They were so thick in the water that it was said you could walk across the river on their backs. In just a few weeks of fishing, a village could gather enough protein to last an entire year. This free abundance gave the people something rare in the ancient world, leisure time. And what do humans do when they don't have to spend every waking hour searching for food? They create art. They create ceremony. They create history. This is where the totem pole comes in. To a stranger, these massive, carved logs of cedar are just statues. But in 1400, they were the billboards of identity. Each figure, the raven, the bear, the killer whale, represented a family's history, their rights to certain fishing spots, and their spiritual ancestors. Without a written alphabet, the totem pole was their library. It told the story of who they were and why they belonged to this misty coast. But there is a deeper side to this wealth. These people were the masters of the red cedar. They called it the tree of life. From a single log, they could carve a 60-foot canoe capable of traveling hundreds of miles across the rough Pacific. They wove the bark into waterproof hats and capes. They even used the wood to create complex boxes that were joined without a single nail. So tight they could hold water for cooking.in this series. We talk about life without money. But here, they had a concept that was very close to it, the gift economy. As we mentioned briefly before, the potlatch was the engine of their society. But let's look closer. Imagine a high-ranking chief hosting a potlatch. He invites rival tribes from hundreds of miles away. He feeds them for days. Then, he gives away his most prized possessions: boxes of fish oil, beautifully woven blankets, and copper shields. Why? Because in this culture, to die wealthy was a disgrace. True power was the ability to give. By giving everything away, the chief created a debt of honor. Now, Everyone else was socially obligated to support him. It was a social security system built on generosity rather than taxes. As the fog rolls in from the Pacific, shrouding the giant cedars in gray silk, we realize that these people lived in a paradise of their own making. They didn't see the forest as a resource to be sold. They saw it as a relative to be respected. In the 1400s, the Pacific Northwest was a testament to what happens when humans have enough to eat, a beautiful place to live, and the creative freedom to carve their souls into the trees. Close your eyes. Can you hear the sound of the adze hitting the cedar? Can you smell the wood smoke and the salty spray? This was a world where wealth was measured by the stories you told and the gifts you gave. Welcome back. To truly understand 1400s America, we have to talk about a ghost. Not the ghost of a person, but the ghost of an idea. An idea that rules our lives today, but back then didn't even have a name. That idea is private property. In our modern world, we live behind fences. We carry deeds in our pockets and titles to our cars. We look at a piece of the earth and say, "This is mine. I bought it. I own it to the exclusion of all others." But in the 1400s, if you tried to explain this concept to a native person, they wouldn't just be confused, they would think you were joking. Or perhaps that you had lost your mind. To the people of the 1400s, the land was like the air or the ocean. How can you own the wind? How can you fence off the rain? In this chapter, we are going to dive into the economics of use. You see, while they didn't believe in ownership, they did believe in stewardship. This is a subtle but profound difference. Today, if you own a house, you can burn it down if you want to. It's yours. In 1400, you didn't own the field. You had the right to plant there. And that right lasted only as long as you actually used the land. If you left, the land returned to the great mystery, waiting for the next person who needed it. Imagine the freedom in that. There was no rent. There were no mortgages. No one lived in fear of being evicted from the earth. But this didn't mean there were no rules. In fact, the rules were stricter than ours. They were governed by the law of the gift. If you were a hunter in the Great Lakes region and you brought down a deer, that deer wasn't yours just because you shot the arrow. The deer was a gift from the forest. Therefore, the meat belonged to anyone in the village who was hungry. To eat a full meal while your neighbor's stomach was growling was seen as a form of theft. Theft from the community's soul. Let's look at the Three Sisters gardens, the corn, beans, and squash. In the 1400s, these gardens were often communal. The women of the tribe worked them together. There were no trespassing signs. Instead, there were no wasting signs, unwritten, but understood by every child. You took what you needed for your family, and the rest was stored in a central granary. This wasn't socialism as we think of it today. It was family. The entire tribe was one house. This concept extended even to the things they made. A beautiful clay pot or a finely crafted bow was yours while you used it, but there was a constant pressure to give it away. Generosity was the only way to gain status. In our world, a billionaire is respected for how much they accumulated. In the 1400s, a person was respected for how much they distributed. When Europeans eventually arrived and asked to buy the land, the indigenous people thought they were being asked to share it. They thought the payment, the beads, the knives, the cloth, was a gift to seal a friendship, not a price to end a relationship with the soil. They signed treaties thinking they were inviting guests into their home, while the guests thought they were buying the house and kicking the host out. As we sit in the silence of this thought, ask yourself, who is truly wealthier? The person who owns a square of dirt but lives in fear of losing it? Or the person who owns nothing but knows that as long as the earth lives, they will be fed by their brothers and sisters? In 1400, the economy was not a ledger of numbers. It was a web of stories. It was the understanding that we are not owners of the world, but merely guests passing through. Take a deep breath. That air you just breathed? You don't own it. It moved through you, and now it moves to someone else. That was the 1400s. Everything was a breath. Everything was a loan from the future. Stop button, welcome back. In our last chapter, we looked at the invisible laws of ownership. Today, we look at the physical lines that connected the continent, the ancient trade routes. There is a common myth that before 1492, the people of North America lived in isolated bubbles, never seeing anyone beyond their own valley. This couldn't be further from the truth. In the year 1400, the continent was draped in a massive, invisible web of trails. If you could see it from space, it would look like a nervous system pulsing with the movement of people and ideas. In a world without money, how do you move goods from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes? You walk. Imagine a trader in 1400. He is carrying a pack on his back, supported by a tump line across his forehead. He isn't walking for exercise. He is a professional bridge between worlds. He speaks 3 or 4 languages, and when he reaches a territory where he doesn't know the tongue, he uses a complex sign language that was understood from the Rockies to the Atlantic. Let's look at the trade items. These weren't just random objects. They were the gold of the 1400s. First, there was obsidian. This black, volcanic glass could be knapped into an edge sharper than a modern surgical scalpel. Archaeologists have found obsidian from the Yellowstone region of Wyoming all the way in the burial mounds of Ohio. That is a journey of 2,000 miles. Think about that. In 1400, an object traveled across half a continent, changing hands from one tribe to another through forests, mountains, and plains without a single receipt ever being printed. Then, there was the seashell, specifically the Marginella shells from the warm waters of the Atlantic. These were found in the far reaches of the interior, used as jewelry and sacred objects. To a person living in the frozen north, a shell from the southern coast wasn't just a bead. It was a piece of the sun. It was a fragment of a world they would never see, but through trade, they could touch it. But the most important currency of trade wasn't stone or shell. It was salt. In our world, salt is so cheap we throw it on the ground to melt ice. In 1400, salt was life. It was the only way to preserve meat and fish for the long winters. There were salt trails that led to natural salt springs in places like modern-day New York and Louisiana. Tribes would travel for weeks to reach these springs. They didn't fight over them. They traded for the right to harvest. And then there was the Great Water Highway. The Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri, the Columbia, these were the interstates of the 1400s. The birch bark canoe was a miracle of technology. It was light enough to be carried over land, a portage, and strong enough to carry hundreds of pounds of cargo. You could start in the heart of the continent and, with enough time, reach the ocean. What's fascinating is that these trade networks moved more than just stuff. They moved stories. They moved songs. They moved seeds. If a new variety of corn was developed in the South that could grow faster or resist drought, it wouldn't stay in the South. Within a few decades, that seed would find its way into the gardens of the North, passed from hand to hand, friend to friend, across the vastness. There was a profound trust in this system. Trade was always preceded by ritual. You didn't just walk up and start buying. You sat down. You smoked a pipe. You shared a meal. You established a fictive kinship, essentially saying, for the duration of this trade, we are brothers. In our world, trade is often cold and impersonal. We buy things from people we will never meet, produced by machines we will never see. In 1400, every object in your hand had a face attached to it. You knew who made it, who brought it to you, and the stories they told while they sat by your fire. As we look at these ancient paths, many of which have become our modern highways today, we realize that the 1400s was a world of profound connection. No one was truly alone. Every footprint on a trail was a message to the next traveler. You are not the first to pass this way, and you will not be the last. Take a moment to listen. Can you hear the soft thud of thousands of moccasins on the dirt? The world of 1400 wasn't standing still. It was a continent in constant, beautiful motion. Welcome back. We have walked the trade routes and stood on the mounds of great cities. But history isn't just made of big events. It is made of mornings. It is made of the way a person wakes up, breathes the air, and begins their work. In the modern world, we live by the clock. Our lives are chopped into seconds, minutes, and hours. We are always on time or late. But in the 1400s, there was no such thing as being late. You were simply in or out of rhythm with the natural world. Imagine waking up in a long house or a teepee. The first thing you feel isn't the buzz of an alarm, but the change in temperature. The air is blue and cold. The fire from the night before has faded into glowing red eyes in the hearth. Your first ritual of the day isn't checking a screen, it is giving thanks. In almost every culture across the continent in 1400, the sunrise was a sacred event. You didn't just start your day. You greeted the sun as a relative. Many would step outside, face the east, and offer a pinch of tobacco or a silent prayer. This wasn't just religion, it was a grounding. Before you did anything for yourself, you acknowledged your place in the universe. By mid-morning, the economy of the hands begins. In our world, most of us don't make the things we use. In 1400, if you held a spoon, you likely carved it. If you wore a shirt, you had tanned the hide and stitched the bone needle through it. Think about the sheer amount of slow work involved. Imagine a woman sitting in the dappled sunlight. She is making a basket. She isn't just weaving, she is talking. This is the social internet of the 1400s. Work was rarely done in silence or isolation. Men worked together to chip flint into arrowheads. Women worked together to grind corn into meal. The air was filled with the sound of laughter, gossip, and the teaching of children. In the 1400s, education didn't happen in a building. It happened in the now. A young boy would watch his uncle's hands for hours, learning exactly how much pressure to apply to a piece of cedar. A young girl would learn the difference between a medicinal root and a poisonous one by the texture of the leaf. This was a world of hyper-awareness. To survive without money, you had to be an expert on everything in your immediate environment. You had to know the mood of the wind and the language of the birds. Noon brings the main meal. There were no fast food breaks. Eating was a communal celebration. Whether it was a stew of venison and squash or a feast of roasted salmon, you didn't eat until everyone was served. The concept of food insecurity was a communal problem, not an individual one. If the pots were full, the village was happy. As the sun begins to dip, the rituals change. This is the time for the oral library. In a world without books, the elders were the most valuable resource the tribe possessed. As the fire is fed for the night, the stories begin. These weren't just fairy tales. They were maps. They were legal codes. They were history books disguised as legends. A story about a great bear might actually be a lesson on how to navigate by the stars. A story about a trickster coyote might be a warning about social behavior. By nightfall, the world becomes truly dark. Not the gray dark of our cities, but a thick, velvet blackness where the stars look like holes poked in the floor of heaven. There is no blue light to keep your brain awake. Your body follows the melatonin of the earth. You slip into sleep surrounded by the breathing of your family, the smell of wood smoke, and the knowledge that tomorrow the sun will rise and the cycle will begin again. In the 1400s, life was hard, yes. There was cold, there was hunger, and there was pain. But there was also a profound sense of belonging. No one woke up wondering if they had a purpose. Their purpose was written in the sunrise, the hunt, the harvest, and the stories told around the fire. As you go about your day to day, look at your watch. Then, look at the sun. For a moment, try to forget the minutes. Just feel the rhythm. That is the heartbeat of 1400. Stop button, welcome back. In our last chapter, we lived through a single day in the 1400s. Today, we ask, how did these millions of people stay fed without a single supermarket, refrigerator, or global supply chain? The answer lies in a relationship. In the 1400s, food wasn't a product. It was a relative. Let's go to the gardens of the East and the South. Here, we find the most famous agricultural trio in human history, the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. To the people of the 1400s, these weren't just ingredients. They were a biological miracle given by the Creator. Imagine a mound of earth. In the center, you plant corn. It grows tall and strong, a golden pillar reaching for the sun. But corn is greedy. It takes nitrogen out of the soil. That's where the second sister, the bean, comes in. The bean vine climbs up the corn stalk, using it as a natural trellis. And in return, the bean fixes nitrogen back into the soil, feeding the corn. Then comes the third sister, the squash. The squash grows low to the ground, its massive, prickly leaves acting as a living carpet. This carpet shades the soil, keeping it moist in the heat of July and preventing weeds from growing. This wasn't just farming. This was an early form of permaculture. These three plants together provided a perfect diet: carbohydrates from the corn, protein from the beans, and vitamins and healthy fats from the squash seeds and flesh. In the 1400s, these gardens were so productive that a single village could grow enough food in one summer to last 2 years. But what if you didn't live in a farming village? What if you lived in the deep forests or the mountains? In those places, the entire world was a living larder. 1400s America was not a wild wilderness. It was a managed landscape. Indigenous people used fire as a tool. They would carefully burn the underbrush of forests to create park-like settings. This encouraged the growth of berries and nuts, and it created perfect grazing land for deer and elk. They were farming the forest without ever tilling a field. Think about the acorn. Today, we walk over them on the sidewalk. In 1400, in places like California, the acorn was the wheat of the West. It was a massive labor of love. Women would gather hundreds of pounds of acorns, shell them, grind them into flour, and then leach them with water to remove the bitter tannins. The result was a rich, nutty mush that could sustain a family through the leanest winters. And then there was the water. In the 1400s, the rivers were so clean you could drink from your hand, and they were teeming with life. There were massive fish weirs, intricate stone and wood fences built in the rivers that guided fish into holding pens. You didn't overfish because you only took what you could eat or dry. The rest were released to spawn. It was a circular economy of protein. What's truly beautiful about the food system of the 1400s was the spirit of the harvest. When the first corn was ripe or the first salmon arrived, no one ate in secret. There were green corn ceremonies and first salmon feasts. You thanked the plant or the animal for giving its life so you could continue yours. In our world, we are disconnected from our food. We buy meat in plastic wrap and vegetables from different continents. We have forgotten the story of our calories. In 1400, every bite you took had a memory. You remembered the day you planted the seed. You remembered the rain that watered it. You remembered the ancestors who saved the seeds through drought and war so that you could eat today. As we imagine the smell of roasting corn and wood-fired venison wafting through a 1400s village, we realize that they weren't just surviving. They were thriving. They lived in a world of abundance, not because they had more, but because they knew how to dance with the earth. Take a moment to think about your next meal. Where did it come from? Who grew it? In 1400, you would have known the answer to those questions as well as you know your own name. Stop button, welcome back. In our journey through 1400s America, we've explored the spirit and the food. But how did people protect themselves? How did they cut, sew, and build? Today, we look at technology. In the modern world, we think technology means something with a battery. In 1400, technology meant knowing the exact molecular structure of a rock or the chemical properties of a deer's brain. Let's start with the stone. Imagine you are holding a piece of chert or obsidian. To the untrained eye, it's just a rock. But to a toolmaker in the 1400s, it was a pre-form for a miracle. They practiced a craft called flint knapping. Using a hammerstone and an antler tine, they would strike the rock at precisely a 45-degree angle. They weren't just smashing it. They were sending shockwaves through the stone to flake off edges that were, quite literally, one molecule thick. A stone knife from 1400 was often sharper than the steel knives the Europeans would later bring. This wasn't primitive. It was a refined, thousands of years old physics lesson passed down from father to son. Every arrowhead was a signature of the person who made it. Now let's look at clothing. In the 1400s, there was no fast fashion. Your clothes were your second skin. Most clothing was made from buckskin, the hide of a deer. But you don't just take a skin off a deer and wear it. You have to tan it. This is where the incredible brain tanning process comes in. Every animal, it was said, has just enough brains to tan its own hide. The oils in the brain were worked into the skin to break down the fibers, making the leather as soft as silk and as tough as denim. Then, it was smoked over a slow fire. This smoking process wasn't just for color, it made the leather waterproof. If you got caught in a rainstorm in 1400, your buckskin shirt wouldn't get stiff when it dried, it stayed soft. Think about the detail. Women would spend months decorating a single tunic. They didn't have plastic beads. They used porcupine quills. They would take the sharp quills, flatten them with their teeth, dye them using roots and berries, yellow from sunflowers, red from ochre, and sew them into intricate geometric patterns. This was the language of the needle. Your clothes told people your tribe, your status, and your personal achievements before you ever said a word. In the colder north, technology meant the parka and the moccasin. The Inuit and Yupik people created waterproof clothing using seal intestines, sewn so tightly with sinew that they were literally airtight. It was the world's first Gore-Tex, and the moccasin was designed to feel the earth. In 1400, you didn't stomp over the land. You felt the twigs, the moisture, and the vibrations of the soil through your feet. Everything was biodegradable. In our world, we have landfills full of polyester and plastic that will last 10,000 years. In 1400, when a tool broke or a shirt wore out, you gave it back to the earth. It turned into soil. It fed the grass that fed the deer that would eventually provide the next shirt. It was a perfect, closed-loop system. Wealth, in this context, was having the patience to make things well. A man with one perfectly balanced bow was richer than a man with 10 poorly made ones. A woman with one beautifully quilled cradleboard for her child was a master of her universe. As we imagine the tactile world of 1400, the softness of the leather, the sharpness of the obsidian, the smell of the smoke-cured hide, we realize that these people weren't lacking anything. They had mastered the materials of their world with a level of skill that we have largely forgotten. Take a look at the clothes you are wearing right now. Do you know who made them? Do you know what they are made of? In 1400, your clothes were a part of your story. They were a gift from the animals and a labor of your own hands. Welcome back. In our previous chapters, we looked at the tools people held in their hands. Today, we look at the tools they held in their minds. In the modern world, we are people of the page. We trust what is written. If it isn't in a book or a database, we fear it will be forgotten. But in 1400s America, there were no alphabets as we know them. There were no printing presses. Yet, people possessed a memory so vast and so precise that it would make a modern scholar weep. This was the era of oral history. Imagine being an elder in a Cherokee or a Salish village. You are the hard drive of your people. You are responsible for remembering every treaty, every genealogy, every medicinal recipe, and every law. If you forget, the culture dies. Because of this, the 1400s was a time of sacred listening. When a story was told, it wasn't just for entertainment. It was a transfer of data. Storytellers were trained from childhood. They used mnemonic devices, tools to help the brain remember. One of the most famous was the winter count. Among the Plains tribes, a historian would paint a single, symbolic image on a buffalo hide for every year. One year might be marked by a falling star, another by a great snow. When the historian touched that symbol, it unlocked a 3-hour story in his mind. The hide was the index, his voice was the book. But the most incredible mnemonic tool was wampum. We've mentioned these shell beads before, but let's look at them as a language. The Haudenosaunee wove these beads into belts with specific patterns. These weren't just decorations. A wampum belt was a legal document. When a wampum keeper ran his fingers over the purple and white shells, he was reading. The beads triggered the specific words of a law or a treaty. In 1400, the word was literally something you could touch. This oral culture changed the very nature of human thought. In our world, words are cheap. We type millions of them every day. We delete them. We forget them. But in a world without money or writing, your word was your currency. If you said you would do something, you did it. If you told a history incorrectly, you were shamed. Truth wasn't something you found in a library. Truth was something you carried in your breath. There was also a staggering diversity of languages. In 1400, North America was more linguistically diverse than Europe. There were over 300 distinct languages, falling into dozens of completely different language families. A person from the Florida coast would find the language of a person from the Great Lakes as foreign as Mandarin is to Spanish, and yet they found ways to communicate. They developed sign language. Across the Great Plains, thousands of people who couldn't speak a single word to each other could discuss complex trade deals, star charts, and peace treaties using a sophisticated system of hand gestures. It was the world's first universal language, one that relied on the eyes and the body rather than the ear. As the fire dies down in our 1400s longhouse, the storyteller finishes. The children have listened so intently that the story is now part of their own neural pathways. They will tell it to their children, and they to theirs. This is why we still know these stories today, despite 500 years of upheaval. In the 1400s, history wasn't something that sat on a shelf gathering dust. History was a living thing. It moved through the air. It lived in a heartbeat. It was the bridge between the ancestors who had passed and the seventh generation yet to be born. Close your eyes. Can you hear the rhythm of the rattle? Can you feel the weight of a story that has been told for 1,000 years? In 1400, you didn't read the world. You listened to it, and the world, in its own way, spoke back. Welcome back. In our previous chapter, we explored the living library of the mind. Today, we look at the social structures that held these minds together. In the modern world, we are used to vertical power. We have a CEO, a president, a boss. Someone is always at the top, and someone is always at the bottom. But in 1400s America, most societies operated on horizontal power. To understand this, we have to look at the council. Imagine a large circle of people. In many tribes, there was no throne. Everyone sat at the same level. If you were a great warrior or a wise grandmother, people listened to you more, but you didn't have the power to force anyone to do anything. In 1400, authority was earned every single day. If a leader made a series of bad decisions, the people didn't wait for an election. They simply stopped following him. They would move their teepees or their families to a different part of the forest. The ultimate check on a leader's power was the people's freedom to leave. But don't mistake this for a lack of structure. These societies were incredibly organized, often through clans. A clan was like an extended family based on an animal ancestor. The wolf, the turtle, the bear. Your clan was your identity. If you were a member of the turtle clan in a village in Georgia, and you traveled 1,000 miles to a village in New York, the turtle clan, they would treat you as a brother. They would feed you, house you, and protect you. This transcontinental kinship was the social safety net of the 1400s. In the East, as we discussed with the Haudenosaunee, the hierarchy was matrilineal. Your family name and your property came from your mother. When a man married, he moved into his wife's house. If the marriage didn't work out, the woman would place the man's belongings outside the door of the longhouse. That was the divorce. The social hierarchy was built on the stability of women. However, there were exceptions to this equality. In the southeast, near the Mississippi River, there were societies called chiefdoms. These were more like what we think of as kingdoms. At the top was a figure like the great son of the Natchez people. He was considered a living deity. He lived on top of a massive mound, and he was so sacred that his feet were rarely allowed to touch the ordinary earth. But even in these monarchies, the concept of wealth was different. The great son didn't collect taxes to buy a private jet or build a vault of gold. He collected tribute, food, furs, and shells to redistribute it. A leader's job was to be a great provider. If there was a famine and the leader's granaries were full while the people were starving, his divinity would be questioned immediately. Power was a contract of care. Then there was the role of the two-spirit people. In many 1400s cultures, gender wasn't a strict binary. There were individuals who possessed both masculine and feminine spirits. These people weren't outcasts. They were often seen as being double-blessed. They held high social status, often serving as healers, matchmakers, or keepers of oral traditions. Their presence in the social hierarchy proves how flexible and inclusive these ancient societies could be. In our world, we measure status by how much you can command others. In 1400, status was measured by how much you could influence others through your character. There were no jails. There were no police. If you broke a law, the punishment wasn't a fine. It was shame. To be laughed at by your clan, or to have the elders turn their backs on you, was a fate worse than death. You relied on the group for everything. So the group's opinion was the ultimate law. As we look back at the circles of 1400, we see a world that prioritized the we over the I. It was a world where no one was a billionaire, but no one was a homeless person either. Everyone had a place in the circle. Take a breath. Imagine a world where your importance isn't defined by your title, but by the weight of your words and the kindness of your hands. That was the social heart of 1400. Welcome back. We have looked at how the people of the 1400s organized their bodies and their societies. Today, we look at how they organize their souls. In the modern world, we often treat spirituality as something we do on a specific day of the week or in a specific building. We see the world around us as resources. Rocks are just minerals, trees are just lumber. But in 1400s America, the world was alive. Every mountain, every river, every gust of wind had a spirit. This is what scholars call animism. But for the people living it, it was simply the truth. Imagine walking through a forest in 1400. You don't feel like an observer. You feel like you are being observed. The ancient cedar tree isn't just a plant. It is a grandfather. The river isn't just H2O. It is a powerful being that allows you to pass. Because of this, life was a constant, 24-hour conversation with the divine. There was no money to buy forgiveness or taxes to pay for grace. Instead, there was reciprocity. Before a hunter pulled the string of his bow, he would often ask permission from the spirit of the animal. If the hunt was successful, he didn't boast about his skill. He knelt by the fallen deer and offered tobacco, thanking the animal for giving its life so his children could live. This wasn't a ritual of guilt. It was a ritual of balance. In the 1400s, you never took something without giving something back, even if it was just a prayer or a handful of sacred herbs. Let's look at the medicine wheel, found across the Great Plains and the West. These are massive stone circles laid out on the earth. They were the cathedrals of the 1400s. But unlike a cathedral, they had no roof. The roof was the sky. The medicine wheel represented the four directions, the four seasons, and the four stages of life. It was a physical map of the soul's journey. By sitting at the center, you were aligning yourself with the rotation of the planets and the movement of the stars in the southwest. Spirituality was tied to the Kachinas. These were the spirits of the clouds, the rain, and the ancestors. During the dry months, men would dress in elaborate masks and costumes to become the Kachinas. They weren't acting. They believed the spirit literally entered their bodies to dance for the rain. In 1400, a dance wasn't a performance. It was a biological necessity. If you didn't dance, the rain wouldn't fall. If the rain didn't fall, the corn wouldn't grow. Spirituality was the fuel of survival. But perhaps the most powerful spiritual concept of the 1400s was the vision quest. When a young person reached a certain age, they would go into the wilderness alone, and no food, no water, no fire. For 4 days, they would sit and wait. They weren't looking for a job or a career. They were looking for a song or a name. They were waiting for the universe to tell them who they were meant to be. In a world without bank accounts, your identity, given to you by the spirits, was your most valuable possession. Once you knew your purpose, no one could take it from you. There was no devil in the 1400s in the way Europeans understood it. There was no hell. There was only balance and imbalance. If you were greedy, or if you disrespected the earth, you weren't sinning. You were becoming sick. You were out of tune with the great mystery, Wakantanka, or Gitche Manitou. The goal of life was to walk the red road, the path of harmony. As we sit in the silence of our imagination, feeling the smoke of the sacred sage, we realize that the 1400s was a world of profound enchantment. The people didn't feel lonely because they were surrounded by a family of spirits. They didn't feel poor because they owned the sunrise. Take a deep breath. In 1400, that breath wasn't just oxygen. It was the little wind that lives inside you, connected to the great wind that moves the world. You were never alone. You were part of the great breath. Welcome back. We have walked through the spiritual forests of the 1400s. Now, we look at how those forests kept the human body alive. There is a persistent myth that before modern medicine, people simply died of every small infection or lived in constant agony. While it's true they didn't have antibiotics or MRI machines, the people of the 1400s were master pharmacists. They didn't just stumble upon cures. They used a rigorous, thousands-of-year-old system of observation and trial that we now call ethnobotany. In 1400, if you had a headache, a fever, or a broken bone, you didn't reach for a plastic bottle. You reached for the people of the earth, the plants. Let's look at the willow tree. If you were a traveler in the Great Lakes region and developed a fever, a medicine woman would strip the inner bark of a willow. She would brew it into a bitter tea. Today, we know that willow bark contains salicin, the active precursor to aspirin. They didn't need a laboratory to find it. They had the laboratory of the woods. But healing was more than just chemistry. It was holistic. In the 1400s, there was no such thing as a specialist who only looked at your heart or your lungs. If your body was sick, it meant your life was out of balance. A healer, often called a medicine person, would look at your diet, your dreams, your relationships, and your spirit. Imagine a healing ceremony in a southwest pueblo. It might involve a sand painting. The healer would spend hours creating an intricate, colorful map of the universe on the floor using crushed minerals and sands. The patient would sit in the center of the painting. The idea was to recenter the patient within the cosmic order. It was a sophisticated form of psychotherapy and a placebo effect so powerful that it often triggered real biological healing. Surgery also existed, though it looked different. In the 1400s, they used ant suture. If you had a deep cut, certain tribes would use large soldier ants. They would let the ant bite the wound shut, then snap off the body, leaving the head as a natural, biodegradable staple. They used obsidian blades, sharper than modern steel, for clean incisions, and they understood the importance of sterile environments, using smoke and boiled water to cleanse wounds. The 1400s was also an era of dental care. While Europeans of the same era were losing teeth to decay and sugar, indigenous Americans had remarkably healthy mouths. They used chew sticks made from aromatic woods like wild ginger or dogwood, which had natural antibacterial properties. Their diet, free of processed sugars, kept their smiles intact. But perhaps the most famous contribution to the world's medicine cabinet from this era was quinine. Found in the bark of the cinchona tree, though more common in the southern reaches of the Americas, it became the world's first effective treatment for malaria. In a world without money, a healer didn't charge a fee. You didn't get a bill after your treatment. Instead, you gave a gift, perhaps a fine bundle of furs or a basket of rare seeds. The healer's wealth was their reputation. If they could heal, they were protected and fed by the community. Their knowledge was a sacred trust, not a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. As we breathe in the scent of drying sage and boiling cedar, we realize that the 1400s was a world of deep biological intelligence. They knew that for every disease the earth created, it also created a cure. They didn't see themselves as fighting nature. They saw themselves as part of it, learning to listen to what the leaves were trying to say. Next time you take a pill, remember the willow. Next time you see a wildflower, realize it might be a life-saving medicine. In 1400, the pharmacy had no walls. It was the world itself. Stop button, welcome back. We have seen how the people of 1,400 healed their bodies and governed their lands. But how did they pass this massive amount of knowledge to the next generation? How did a child, born into a world without money or writing, learn to be a master of the forest, the desert, or the plains? In the modern world, we separate children from the real world. We put them in rooms for 12 to 16 years to prepare them for life. In 1400, children were never separated from life. From the moment they could walk, they were participants in the survival of their people. Education in 1400 was built on two pillars: observation and autonomy. Imagine a young girl in a Tlingit village. She isn't told to study how to preserve fish. She sits next to her mother and grandmother as they work. She watches the angle of the knife. She smells the smoke of the drying racks. She is given a tiny knife of her own, not a toy, but a real tool. She is trusted. In 1400, play was simply the practice of work. There was no distinction. The classroom was the landscape itself. A father taking his son into the woods wouldn't lecture him. He would stop and ask, "What do you hear?" The boy might say a bird. The father would wait. Then the boy would realize, no, it's the sound of a squirrel dropping a nut, which means the oak trees are ready. This was inquiry-based learning in its purest form. A child was taught to read the world like we read a book. Every bent twig was a sentence. Every change in the wind was a new chapter. But what about social education? In a world without police, how do you teach a child to be a good person? They used the power of story and shame. Children weren't usually spanked or yelled at. If a child was greedy or lazy, an elder might tell a story about a character, like Iktomi the spider or Coyote, who acted that way and suffer the consequences. The child would see their own behavior reflected in the story and feel this social heat of the community's disapproval. They learned that their wealth wasn't what they took for themselves, but how much they were respected by others. Then came the rites of passage. In 1400, you didn't just become an adult because you turned 18. You had to prove it. For a young man, this might mean his first successful hunt, where he was required to give all the meat away to the elders, keeping nothing for himself, a lesson that his strength belonged to the tribe. For a young woman, it might be a period of seclusion during her first moon cycle, where she sat with the older women and learned the deep secrets of life, medicine, and the power of the female spirit. There was a profound respect for the spirit of the child. It was believed that children were newly arrived from the spirit world and often possessed a wisdom that adults had forgotten. Because of this, children were rarely forced to do things. They were invited to participate. As the sun sets and the children settle into their furs, they aren't dreaming of careers. They aren't worried about grades. They're dreaming of the tracks they saw on the mud that day. They are replaying the stories of the stars they heard by the fire. In 1400, education didn't have an end. You were a student until the day you became an ancestor. You learned to be a human being by being useful, by being observant, and by being kind. Take a moment to think about what you know. How much of it did you learn from a screen? And how much did you learn by touching the earth? In 1400, the earth was the only teacher you ever needed. Welcome back. To tell the history of 1400s America as a peaceful utopia would be a lie. Humans, no matter the century, have always struggled with the impulse toward conflict. But in the 1400s, the reason for war and the way it was fought would be unrecognizable to a modern general. In our world, we fight for oil, for borders, for religion, or for regime change. In 1400, there were no standing armies. There was no military-industrial complex. War was a personal, spiritual, and communal decision. The most common form of warfare was the morning war. To understand this, we have to look at how a tribe viewed its people. In a world without money, your wealth was your population. If a smallpox-like disease, even before 1492, or a natural disaster killed members of your clan, the spirit of your tribe was seen as diminished. To replace that spiritual energy, warriors would set out on a raid to capture members of a rival tribe. These captives weren't necessarily treated as slaves. Often, they were literally adopted into the family of the person who had died. They were given the name, the status, and the responsibilities of the deceased. War was a way to heal the population. Another major reason for conflict was counting coup. In the Great Plains, the highest honor a warrior could achieve wasn't killing an enemy. It was touching him. Imagine the bravery required to ride or run up to an armed opponent, touch him with a stick or your hand, and turn away without harming him. This was the ultimate win. It proved your courage and skill while minimizing the loss of life. In 1400, the goal wasn't to annihilate the enemy. It was to prove your superiority and return home safely. However, we must also look at the Mississippian chiefdoms. In the fertile valleys of the South, things were more intense. Because they relied on specific patches of corn-rich land, they did fight over territory. They built massive wooden palisades, walls made of thousands of sharpened logs, to protect their cities. Here, war was more political, led by elite warrior castes who wore copper breastplates and carried heavy stone maces. But even in the most violent times, there were rules of war. Warfare was rarely a surprise blitzkrieg. It was often preceded by rituals and diplomatic warnings. Most importantly, there was the medicine of war. After a battle, a warrior couldn't just walk back into his village and start eating dinner. He was considered spiritually polluted by the act of violence. He had to undergo days of purification, fasting, and bathing to wash away the shadow of the enemy. If you took a life, you had to acknowledge the weight of that act. There was no PTSD as we know it, because the culture provided a path to return from the darkness that, in the 1400s, there was no total war. You didn't burn the forests or poison the water. Why would you? You knew that one day, your children might need that forest. You knew that the enemy was also a human being governed by the same stars and the same great spirit. As we look at the stone war clubs and the flint-tipped arrows in our museums today, we should see them not just as primitive weapons, but as symbols of a time when even conflict had a code. A time when war was a tragic necessity, but peace was the ultimate goal of every council fire. Take a moment to listen. Beyond the drum, there is the silence of the great peace. Even in 1400, the most respected man in the tribe wasn't the one who had killed the most, but the one who had successfully prevented the next war. Welcome back. We have seen how the people of 1400 fought, healed, and taught. But how did they express the beauty they saw in their minds? In our world, we have galleries and museums. We separate art from life. But in 1400, there was no word for art in most indigenous languages. Why? because everything made by hand was expected to be beautiful. A spoon, a shield, a pair of moccasins, these were all canvases. In 1400, to make something ugly was to disrespect the material it was made from. Let's start with the most permanent art form, the petroglyph. Imagine standing in a canyon in the Southwest. You see a wall of dark, sun-blackened rock. Someone, hundreds of years before you, took a harder stone and chipped away that dark desert varnish to reveal the light sandstone underneath. They carved spirals, bighorn sheep, and strange star-headed beings. These weren't just doodles. They were maps of the spirit. Some were astronomical markers, positioned so that on the morning of the winter solstice, a dagger of light would pierce the center of a carved spiral. In 1400, art was a way to synchronize the human clock with the cosmic clock. Now, let's look at the art of the body. In the 1400s, the human body was a walking autobiography. Tattooing was widespread, from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico. Using bone needles and soot from the fire, people marked their skin with their lineage, their protective animal spirits, and their deeds. In the Pacific Northwest, high-ranking individuals were covered in form-line art, flowing, mathematical shapes of ravens and wolves. Your skin told the world who you were, so you never had to introduce yourself. Then there was the alchemy of color. Where did the vibrance come from in a world without synthetic dyes? It came from the earth. Red was often made from ochre, an iron-rich clay. Yellow came from the boiled petals of sunflowers or the pollen of pine trees. Blue was the rarest and most sacred, often derived from ground turquoise or specific copper minerals. The binders were just as fascinating. They used bear fat, egg whites, or even cactus juice to make the paint stick to hides and wood. When a warrior painted his face for a ceremony, he was literally wearing the earth. Let's look at the pottery of the Southeast and the Pueblos. In the 1400s, women were the master chemists of clay. They didn't use a potter's wheel. They used the coil method, building up the walls of jar inch by inch. They polished the surface with smooth river stones until it shone like glass. The designs, the thunderbird or the water serpent, were painted with brushes made from chewed yucca fibers. These pots weren't just for holding water. They were vessels for stories. In a world without money, art was the ultimate status symbol. But not because you owned it. You were respected for the skill it took to create it. A woman who could weave a basket so tight it could hold water without leaking was a celebrity in her village. A man who could carve a pipe out of catlinite stone that felt like silk in the hand was a master. Art was also a way to communicate with the unseen. When a dancer wore a mask made of cedar and feathers, they weren't pretending to be an eagle. Through the art of the mask, they became a bridge to the eagle spirit. Art was the technology used to talk to God as we look at the faded ochre on a canyon wall or the intricate quill work on a 500-year-old tunic. We realized that the 1400s was a world of intense, vivid color. It wasn't primitive or plain. It was a masterpiece in progress. Take a look around you. How much of what you see was made by a human hand that cared about its beauty? In 1400, the answer was everything. Welcome back. We have explored the art, the medicine, and the social soul of 1400. But all of these things existed within a larger frame, the cycle of the year. In the modern world, we try to ignore the seasons. We have air conditioning for the heat and strawberries in February. But in 1400, you lived and died by the tilt of the Earth's axis. Life in 1400 was not a straight line. It was a circle. Let's start with the Great Sleep, winter. In the north, winter was the time of the long dark. For tribes like the Ojibwe or the Cree, this was the most dangerous time of the year. Survival depended on the work you did 6 months prior. Winter was the season of storytelling. Because it was too cold to hunt and the ground was frozen, people spent weeks inside their dwellings. This was when the oral library was opened. It was also a masterclass in boring survival technology. They used snowshoes, an incredible invention of wood and rawhide that allowed a human to float on top of deep drifts to hunt moose or elk that were stuck in the snow. Without the snowshoe, the 1400s north would have been uninhabitable. Then came the awakening, spring. This was often the starving time. The winter stores were running low, and the new plants hadn't yet emerged. But the people of 1400 knew the signs. They watched for the maple moon when the sap began to rise in the trees. They watched for the first return of the migratory birds. Spring wasn't just about flowers. It was about the return of the salmon and the herring. The rivers became the lifeblood of the continent once again. The long days. Summer was the season of total activity. This was the time for the Three Sisters Gardens we discussed. It was the time for the great communal bison hunts on the plains. It was also the time for diplomacy. Because travel was easiest in the summer, this was when the great councils happened. The interstate highways of the trade routes were packed with travelers. In 1400, summer was the season of the global village. And finally, the gathering, autumn. This was the busiest time of all. Every waking hour was spent preparing for the next great sleep. They dried strips of meat, jerky, gathered thousands of nuts, and processed the corn. They used underground silos, deep pits lined with birch bark, to keep their food cool and dry, hidden from both the frost and the forest animals. What is truly fascinating is how their spirituality shifted with the seasons. They didn't have a New Year's Day on January 1st. Their new year was the solstice or the first harvest. They didn't fight the seasons, they mimicked them. When the earth went quiet in winter, the people went quiet. When the earth was loud and growing in summer, the people were loud and growing. In our world, we are productive all year round. We work the same 9 to 5 in July that we do in December. In 1400, that would have been seen as a form of madness. You were meant to rest when the earth rested. You were meant to move when the earth moved. As we end this chapter, imagine the first frost of 1400 hitting the Great Lakes. The smell of wood smoke is thick in the air. The children are huddling under bison robes. There is no fear, only preparation. They have lived this cycle for 10,000 years. The seasons were not an enemy to be conquered. They were a dance partner. And in 1400, the people knew every step of the dance. Welcome to the end of our journey. We have spent hours walking through a continent that, in our modern history books, is often treated as a blank page. But as we've seen, the year 1400 was anything but blank. That it was a masterpiece of human organization, spiritual depth, and scientific brilliance. Today, we stand at a crossroads in our own history. We look back at the people of 1400 not to return to the past, but to remember what it means to be a successful human being on this planet. In the 1400s, wealth was not a number in a bank account. It was the strength of your relationships. It was the knowledge of the plants. It was the ability to give away your most prized possession and feel richer for it. They lived in a world where the economy and the ecology were the same thing. They understood that you cannot have a healthy person in a sick forest. We often ask, what happened to that world? We know the stories of the centuries that followed. The arrival of ships, the clash of cultures, the diseases, and the fences. But the world of 1400 didn't simply vanish. It lives on. It lives on in the seeds. Every time someone plants a Three Sisters garden today, they're touching a technology that was perfected 600 years ago. It lives on in the languages, despite every attempt to silence them. The ancient tongues of this continent are being spoken by a new generation of children who are reclaiming their oral library. It lives on in the philosophy. The idea that we must think 7 generations ahead is no longer just a native idea. It is becoming a global necessity as we face our own environmental challenges. If there is one lesson to take away from our 20-hour journey, it is this: Complexity does not require steel. You can have a sophisticated legal system without a courthouse. You can have a deep understanding of physics without a computer. You can have a life of profound meaning without a single coin in your pocket. IN 1400. The people of North America prove that it is possible for millions of humans to live in abundance without destroying the earth that feeds them. They prove that a society can be built on the principle of enough rather than the principle of more. As we close this series, take a moment to look at the world around you. Look at the trees, the soil beneath the pavement, and the stars above the city lights. That world, the world of 1400, is still there, pulsing beneath the surface. It is waiting for us to remember how to listen to it. The people of 1400 weren't primitive. They were our teachers. They were the architects of a sustainable future that we are only just beginning to imagine. Thank you for walking these ancient paths with me. The fire is dying down. The sun is setting over the Great Plains, and the stories have been told. But the journey doesn't end here. The journey continues every time you look at a river and see a relative, and every time you look at a stranger and see a brother. Welcome to this special concluding session. Over the last 21 chapters, we have painted a vivid picture of 1400. But you might be asking, how do we know? There are no written diaries, no video footage, and no newspapers. How can we be so sure about the diet of a Mississippian farmer or the trade routes of an obsidian merchant? Today, we look at the science of the silent. We look at the clues left behind by a world that didn't use plastic or steel. The first witness is the seed. In the 1400s, when a house burned down or a trash pit was filled, tiny seeds were often carbonized, turned into charcoal. Because they are charcoal, they don't rot. Archaeologists today use a process called flotation. They take soil from 1400 and put it in water. The heavy dirt sinks, but the tiny 600-year-old seeds float to the surface. Under a microscope, these seeds tell us exactly what was growing in the Three Sisters gardens. They show us that the corn was evolving, becoming more resistant to the cold, proving that the farmers of 1400 were active geneticists. The second witness is chemistry. We talked about the great trade networks. How do we know a piece of obsidian in Ohio came from a volcano in Wyoming? Every volcanic eruption has a unique chemical fingerprint, a specific mix of trace elements. Using a tool called X-ray fluorescence, we can read a stone tool and match it to its mountain of origin with 100% accuracy. We can literally trace the footsteps of a trader across 2,000 miles of forest just by the chemistry of the rock in his pack. The third witness is the sky. To understand the spirituality of 1400, we look at archaeoastronomy. We look at the alignment of the great houses at Chaco Canyon or the mounds at Cahokia. When we use computer models to roll back the stars to the year 1400, we find that these buildings weren't placed randomly. They were perfectly aligned with the lunar standstills and the solstices. This proves that the priests of 1400 were master mathematicians, tracking cycles of time that last 18.6 years. The fourth witness is linguistics. By studying the root words of modern indigenous languages, linguists can map how people moved. If two tribes living 500 miles apart use the same word for cedar or salmon, it tells us they were once the same people, or that they traded so heavily they shared a soul. But the most important witness is oral tradition. For a long time, Western science ignored the stories of the elders, calling them myths. But recently, science has begun to catch up. When a tribe's story says, "The mountain shook and the sea rose," and geologists find evidence of a massive earthquake in 1400, we realize that the human memory is the most accurate record of all. As we close this special edition, we realize that the 1400s aren't lost. They're just waiting to be read. The earth is a library, and every layer of soil is a page. In our modern world, We leave behind mountains of plastic that will tell a story of waste. The people of 1400 left behind a story of balance, etched in stone, preserved in seeds, and carried in the wind. Next time you look at a landscape, remember, you aren't just looking at dirt and trees. You're looking at a record. You're looking at a home. You're looking at the year 1400, still speaking to us, if only we have the patience to listen. Welcome back. To truly finish our 20-hour journey, we have to look away from the human villages and look into the eyes of the other residents of 1400. This was a continent of giants. In our world, nature is something we visit in a park. In 1400, nature was the wall-to-wall reality. Imagine the passenger pigeon. Today, they are extinct. But in 1400, they were the most numerous bird on the planet. When a flock took flight in the east, they would literally block out the sun for 3 days. The sound of their wings was like a coming storm. The weight of them landing would snap the branches of ancient oaks. To the people of 1400, this wasn't a nuisance. It was a skyborn gift of protein that sustained entire nations. Then look at the rivers. We think of a big fish today as something you can hold in 2 hands. In 1400, the Atlantic sturgeon and the salmon reached sizes that were prehistoric. There were sturgeon in the Great Lakes that were 10 feet long and lived for 100 years. They were the old ones of the water. The rivers were so thick with life that during spawning seasons, the water changed color, a literal silver and red ribbon flowing through the green heart of the woods. But the 1400s was also a time of the great predators. The grizzly bear didn't just live in the high mountains of the West. They roamed the Great Plains and the river valleys of California. The gray wolf was the shadow of the forest, found in every corner of the continent. This created a specific kind of human character. You didn't walk through the woods with headphones on. You walked with every sense dialed to maximum. You were a participant in a high-stakes game of survival. But interestingly, there was a mutual respect. Indigenous stories from 1400 don't speak of killing the monsters. They speak of the bear people or the wolf people. Humans saw these predators as rival nations. You didn't kill a wolf because you hated it. You killed it only if the balance had been broken. In the South, the jaguar, the 3rd largest cat in the world, still roamed as far north as the American Southwest and the Gulf Coast. To the people of the 1400s, the jaguar was the master of the night, the spirit of the underworld. Its spots represented the stars, and its strength was the goal of every warrior. What made the 1400s unique was the abundance. It wasn't just that there were animals. It was that the carrying capacity of the land was at its peak. This wasn't an accident. By using the control burns we discussed earlier, humans had created a mosaic landscape, pockets of meadow, edges of forest, and clear streams. This is the ultimate edge effect in biology, where biodiversity thrives. The people of 1400 weren't just living in nature. They were the gardeners of the wild. As we end this final reflection, imagine the silence of a 1400s night. No hum of electricity, no distant drone of an airplane. Just the sound of millions of insects, the call of the whippoorwill, and the breathing of a continent that was fully, vibrantly alive. We have lost many of these giants. We have silenced many of these songs. But by remembering the world of 1400, we realize what the earth is capable of. It is capable of a richness beyond our wildest dreams. Thank you for traveling back to the year 1400. The journey is yours now to carry forward. Walk lightly, listen carefully, and remember, the earth remembers. In the year 1400, the high desert of the American Southwest was home to one of the most sophisticated architectural feats in history, the Puebloan cliff dwellings, the architecture of survival. While many cultures built on top of the earth, the ancestral Puebloans built into it. Imagine a massive canyon wall with a natural alcove carved out by thousands of years of erosion. inside this shelf. They built multi-story apartment complexes using hand-cut sandstone blocks and mud mortar. These weren't just shelters. They were climate-controlled masterpieces. Because they were built under a rock overhang, the high summer sun couldn't hit the buildings, keeping them cool. In the winter, the low sun reached deep into the alcove, heating the stones and keeping the families warm throughout the night. The kiva, the spiritual heart. At the center of these stone cities were the kivas. These were circular, underground rooms used for spiritual ceremonies and community meetings. To enter, you had to climb down a ladder through a hole in the roof. Inside, it was completely silent, a place to connect with the sapapu, a small hole in the floor that represented the gateway to the spirit world. The mystery of 1400. By the late 1300s and early 1400s, many of these magnificent cliff cities were being abandoned. Why? Most archaeologists believe a great drought, lasting decades, made farming nearly impossible. But the people didn't vanish. They moved south to the Rio Grande, becoming the modern Hopi, Zuni, and Pueblo nations we know today. They left their stone cities behind as a testament to their brilliance. Welcome back. Today, we leave the inland forests and travel to the mist-covered coast of the Pacific Northwest. In the year 1400, this region was home to some of the wealthiest and most artistically sophisticated societies in human history. Imagine a world where the forest is so thick and the ocean is so rich that you never need to farm. In the 1400s, while much of the world struggled with agriculture, the people of the Northwest, the Haida, the Tlingit, the Kwakwaka'wakw, lived in a state of natural hyperabundance. The architecture of the cedar. The first thing you would notice in 1400 is the smell, the sweet, spicy scent of western red cedar. This tree was the lifeblood of the coast. These people didn't just build huts, they built massive plank houses. Some of these structures were over 100 feet long, built with enormous cedar beams and hand-split planks. The fronts of these houses were often painted with massive, swirling designs of ravens, bears, and killer whales. To walk into a village in 1400 was like walking into a gallery of giants. The totem pole, the vertical history. Standing in front of these houses were the totem poles. In our modern world, we use the phrase low man on the totem pole to mean someone unimportant, but in 1400, that was completely wrong. A totem pole was a legal document carved in wood. It told the story of a family's lineage, their rights to certain fishing spots, and their encounters with the spirit world. Every figure, the wide-eyed owl, the sharp-beaked raven, the powerful grizzly, was a copyrighted crest. You couldn't just carve a whale because you liked it. You had to have the ancestral right to it. These poles were the skyscrapers of the 1400s, reaching toward the sky to declare the pride of a nation. The wealth of the ocean. Why was this society so grand? Because of the salmon. In 1400, the rivers were so full of fish that it was said you could walk across the water on their backs. The people developed a smokehouse technology that allowed them to preserve millions of pounds of protein. Because they didn't have to spend all day looking for food, they had time. They had time to become the greatest wood carvers, weavers, and artists on earth. They created masks with moving parts. Masks that could transform from a human face into a bird's beak with the pull of a string during a dance. The potlatch. The economics of giving. But the most fascinating part of 1400's Northwest life was how they handled money, or rather, the lack of it. They practiced the potlatch. In our world, a rich person is someone who keeps the most. In 1400, in the Northwest, a rich person was someone who gave the most away. A chief would host a potlatch and give away hundreds of hand-woven blankets, carved canoes, and copper shields until he had nothing left for himself. This didn't make him poor. It made him the most powerful man in the region. His wealth was the debt of gratitude the community owed him. It was a system that prevented poverty and ensured that resources were always moving. The spiritual deep. Finally, we must talk about the ocean spirits. In 1400, the sea wasn't just water, it was a kingdom. They believed in the salmon people, who lived in underwater villages and put on fish skins every year to sacrifice themselves for humans. This belief created a deep conservation ethic. If you didn't treat the first salmon of the year with absolute respect, returning its bones to the water in a specific ritual, the salmon people wouldn't return. Imagine the 1400s night. The fire reflecting off the painted walls of the plank house, the sound of the ocean outside, and the masked dancers bringing the spirits of the deep to life. It was a world of drama, dignity, and a profound understanding that human beings are guests of the natural world. Welcome back. Today, we stand in the center of the continent. In the year 1400, the Great Plains was a sea of grass, so tall it could hide a man on his feet. But we have to clear our minds of one image, the horse. In 1400, there were no horses in North America. They had been extinct on this continent for 10,000 years and wouldn't return for another century and a half. Imagine life on the vast plains where every single mile was covered on foot. This was a world of the pedestrian nomads, the engineering of the travois. Without horses or wheels, how did a family move their entire life across hundreds of miles? They used the dog. In 1400, the dog was the only pack animal. They developed a brilliant tool called the travois, two long poles hitched to a dog's shoulders, dragging behind them with a platform for baggage. Life was measured by the strength of your dogs and the endurance of your legs. In 1400, the people of the plains were arguably the greatest long-distance walkers in human history. A group could move 15 miles a day, every day, following the rhythm of the clouds and the buffalo. The ghost of the plains, the bison hunt. In 1400, the bison, buffalo, was the center of the universe. There were roughly 30 to 60 million of them. But how do you hunt a 2,000-pound animal that can outrun a human when you only have a stone-tipped arrow in your own 2 feet? The hunters of 1,400 were masters of psychology and terrain. They used the buffalo jump. Imagine a group of hunters wearing wolf skins, moving slowly to herd the bison toward a hidden cliff. Others would stand along drive lanes, long lines of stone cairns, shouting and waving ropes. At the final moment, the lead runner, the buffalo caller, would sprint toward the cliff edge, tricking the lead bull into a stampede. This wasn't just a hunt. It was a massive communal operation. A single successful jump could provide enough meat, hide, and bone to support 500 people for an entire winter. The teepee, the portable masterpiece. Because they were always moving, the people of 1400 perfected the teepee. In the summer heat, the bottom could be rolled up to let the breeze in. In the winter, an inner liner created an insulation gap, keeping the heat of a tiny fire inside. A teepee was a woman's domain. She owned it, she built it, and she could strike it down in 15 minutes. In 1400, the home was not a fixed point on a map. It was wherever the family decided to unroll the buffalo robes. The sound of the grass. In 1400, the plains were not empty. They were a complex network of trade. You would see traders from the Mississippi carrying corn and pottery, meeting nomads who carried dried bison meat and high-quality flint. They spoke in sign language, a sophisticated hand talk that allowed a person who spoke Siouan to have a deep philosophical debate with someone who spoke Algonquian. Welcome back. Today, we leave the quiet prairies and move into the heart of central Mexico. In the year 1400, a group of people called the Mexica, better known to us as the Aztecs, were doing something impossible. They were building a massive, glittering metropolis in the middle of a lake. Imagine standing on a mountain overlooking Lake Texcoco in 1400. Below you isn't just water, but a city of white stone and bright colors, connected to the mainland by giant stone causeways. This was Tenochtitlan, the engineering of the floating gardens. The most boring yet brilliant achievement of 1400 was how they fed a city of over 200,000 people. They didn't have enough land, so they created it. They built chinampas, artificial islands made of layers of mud and decaying vegetation held together by willow trees. In 1400, these floating gardens were the most productive agricultural systems on Earth. They could harvest up to 7 crops a year. While Europe was struggling with unpredictable harvests, the Aztecs had created a permanent, self-sustaining food factory, the Great Market of Tlatelolco. In 1400, if you wanted to see the true power of the Aztecs, you went to the market. It was so organized that it made European markets of the time look like chaos. There were judges who patrolled the stalls to ensure prices were fair and measures were honest. You would see gold from the south, turquoise from the north, and feathers of the quetzal bird that shone like emeralds. There was no metal money. Instead, they used cacao beans, chocolate, and lengths of cotton cloth as currency. In 1400, you could literally buy a house with a bag of chocolate. The Templo Mayor, the center of the universe. At the very center of the city stood the Templo Mayor, a dual pyramid reaching toward the clouds. In 1400, it was painted in vivid reds and blues. To the Aztecs, this wasn't just a building. It was the Coatepec, the snake mountain where their sun god was born. Their religion was a high-stakes deal with the universe. They believed the sun was in a constant battle with the darkness, and it was their job to provide the precious water, energy to keep the world turning. In 1400, life was a beautiful, terrifying responsibility. The education of the young. One of the most modern aspects of 1400's Aztec life was their school system. They were one of the first societies in history to have universal, mandatory education for both boys and girls, regardless of social rank. Commoners went to the Telpacali to learn history, religion, and military arts. The nobles went to the Calmecac to learn the high arts, astronomy, poetry, and a complex writing system of glyphs. In 1400, being an Aztec meant being a person of culture and discipline. Welcome back. Today we ascend. We are in the Andes of South America. In the year 1400, while the Aztecs were expanding their floating city in the north, a leader named Viracocha Inca was consolidating power in a high-altitude valley called Cusco. Imagine living in a world where there is no flat land. Every farm, every house, and every road must be carved out of the side of a mountain. This was the genius of the Inca, the stone masonry of the gods. The first thing that would stun you in 1400 is the stone. The Inca were the greatest stonemasons the world has ever seen. They didn't use mortar, no glue, no cement. Instead, they shaped massive granite boulders so precisely that they fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. In 1400, their walls were earthquake-proof. When the ground shook, the stones would dance in place and then settle back into their original positions. Even today, you cannot fit a razor blade between these 600-year-old stones. The vertical farm, the Andins. How do you feed an empire on a cliff? You build Andins, massive stone terraces that turn a mountain into a giant staircase. In 1400, the Inca were master biologists. They realized that every 200 feet of elevation created a different climate. They used these terraces to warm the soil, allowing them to grow corn at altitudes where it should never survive. They cultivated over 3,000 varieties of potatoes, along with quinoa and coca. In 1400, the Inca had more food security than almost any nation in Europe. The Quipu, talking in strings. In 1400, the Inca managed an entire empire without a written alphabet. Instead, they used the quipu. This was a device made of colored strings and knots. By feeling the position, the direction, and the type of knot, a Quipikamaic, the record keeper, could tell you exactly how many bags of corn were in a warehouse 500 miles away or how many soldiers were ready for battle. It was a 3D binary code, a fiber computer that held the memory of the empire. The road of the sun, the Kapak Nan. The glue of the 1400s Inca world was the Great Road. They built over 25,000 miles of paved roads across the highest peaks on Earth. They built suspension bridges made of woven grass that could hold a caravan of 100 llamas. They had a postal system called the Chaskis. These were elite runners stationed every few miles. A message, or a fresh fish from the coast, could travel 150 miles in a single day through the mountains. In 1400, the Inca were more connected than the Roman Empire at its peak. Welcome back. Today, we leave the organized stone cities of the Inca and travel north into the Ceja de Selva, the eyebrow of the jungle. In the year 1400, this was a land of mist, bromeliads, and orchids. Here, on mountain ridges 10,000 feet high, lived the Chachapoya. While the Inca built with sharp angles and straight lines, the Chachapoya built in circles. Their world was one of curves, spirals, and hidden fortresses tucked into the clouds. The fortress of Quilap, the granite giant. The crown jewel of their world in 1400 was Quilap. Imagine a limestone fortress so massive that it contains 3 times more stone than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its walls rise 60 feet high, straight up from a cliff edge. In 1400, inside these walls sat over 400 round stone houses with conical thatched roofs. These houses were decorated with friezes, geometric patterns in the stone that looked like the eyes of jaguars or snakes. To enter Quilap, you had to walk through a narrow, high-walled passage that grew tighter and tighter, allowing only one person to pass at a time. It was the ultimate security gate of the 1400s. The sarcophagi of Karagia, the standing dead. The Chachapoya had a relationship with death that was both beautiful and terrifying. In 1400, if you looked up at the sheer limestone cliffs surrounding their valleys, you would see the Watchers. These were the Purunmicus, 8-foot-tall sarcophagi made of clay, stick, and grass. They were shaped like human figures with oversized, stern faces and painted with red and white ochre. They were perched on ledges hundreds of feet in the air, accessible only by ropes. Inside were the mummified remains of their ancestors. In 1400, the dead weren't buried. They were placed on the mountain so they could keep their eyes on the living, the resistance of the clouds. In 1400, the Chachapoya were at the height of their power, but they were feeling the pressure. The Inca Empire was expanding from the south, trying to conquer the cloud forest to control the trade of coca leaves and exotic bird feathers. The Chachapoya were legendary warriors. They didn't have a central king. Instead, they were a confederation of powerful chiefdoms. They fought with slings and maces, using the vertical terrain to trap their enemies in the fog. In 1400, the War of the Clouds was just beginning, a struggle that would last for decades. Welcome back. Today, we enter the largest tropical rainforest on Earth. For centuries, Western history told us the Amazon in 1400 was a vast, empty wild inhabited only by small, nomadic groups. But modern science has uncovered a stunning reality. In 1400, the Amazon was a managed civilization. Imagine flying over the southern Amazon in the year 1400. You wouldn't see an unbroken canopy of trees. Instead, you would see a network of perfectly straight roads, 150 feet wide, connecting large circular plazas. The Kahiku Complex, the Garden Cities. In the Upper Xingu region, researchers have found evidence of a sprawling galactic city structure. In 1400, these weren't cities of stone, but cities of earth and orchard. The people lived in large, long houses arranged around a central square. But the truly boring, yet brilliant part was their perimeter. Every village was surrounded by deep defensive moats and high wooden palisades. Between the villages were massive orchards of piqui fruit, acai palms, and Brazil nuts. In 1400, the Amazon was a giant, edible forest. Terra preta, the alchemy of soil. The greatest mystery of the 1400s Amazon is the terra preta, black earth. Normally, jungle soil is thin and nutrient poor. But in 1400, millions of people were farming on rich, charcoal black soil that stayed fertile for centuries. How? They manufactured the soil. They mixed charcoal, bone meal, and manure into the ground. This created a living soil that actually grew back and held nutrients in the heavy rain that in 1400, the Amazonian people weren't just farmers. They were soil engineers who created a sustainable foundation for a population that may have reached 10 million people. The water highway. In 1400, the Amazon River and its tributaries were the busiest highways on the planet. Enormous canoes, some 50 feet long, carried goods from the Andes to the Atlantic. There was a lingua franca, a trade language, that allowed people from hundreds of different tribes to negotiate for gold, feathers, salt, and sacred tobacco. The river wasn't a barrier. It was the thread that sewed the continent together. In 1400, a person in the deep jungle was more connected to international trade than a peasant in rural France. Welcome back. Today, we stand on the edge of the world. It is 1400, and we are in the high Arctic. For most of humanity, this place is an uninhabitable wasteland. But for the Thule people, this was a land of plenty. In the 1400s, the Thule had just finished a rapid expansion across the top of the globe. They didn't just survive the ice, they owned it. They were the most technologically specialized people of their era. The engineering of the Umiak and kayak. The first thing that would stun you in 1400 is their naval technology. The Thule built the Umiak, a massive open boat made of driftwood or whalebone frames covered in waterproof walrus skin. And Umiak could carry 20 people and tons of gear. But their fighter jet was the kayak. In 1400, the kayak was a marvel of custom engineering. Each boat was built specifically to the body measurements of its owner. It was a cockpit that allowed a hunter to become one with the freezing ocean. They used Tullik waterproof jackets that tied directly to the boat, making the hunter unsinkable. If they flipped over, they practiced the Eskimo roll to snap back up. In 1400, they were the masters of the most dangerous waters on Earth, the whale hunters. Why did they move so far north? For the bowhead whale. In 1400, the Thule were the world's premier whalers. A single bowhead whale provided enough meat, blubber, fuel, and bone to support an entire village for a year. They used sophisticated harpoons with toggling heads. Once the point entered the whale, it turned sideways like an anchor, so it couldn't be pulled out. They attached inflated sealskin floats to the line to tire the whale out. This was high-stakes, industrial-scale hunting in the most extreme environment imaginable. The winter house, bone and earth. Forget the snow igloo for a moment. That was for travel. In 1400, the Thule lived in permanent winter houses made of the massive jawbones and ribs of bowhead whales. They would dig into the earth to use the ground as insulation, then arch the whale ribs over the top to create a roof, covering it all with sod and skin. To enter, you had to crawl through a cold trap, a tunnel built lower than a house floor, so that heavy cold air stayed down in the tunnel while the warm air stayed up in the living area. Even at minus 40 degrees Celsius outside, a single oil lamp made of soapstone, a cullic, could keep the inside at a comfortable 15 degrees Celsius. The Iron Men. In 1400, a secret trade was happening in the Arctic. The Thule were using meteoritic iron. In North Greenland, They found pieces of the Cape York meteorite. Without smelting or furnaces, they used stone hammers to cold forge the iron into tiny, razor-sharp blades for their harpoons and knives. In 1400, the Thule were effectively an Iron Age society in the middle of a Stone Age world, thousands of miles away from any forge. Welcome back. Today, we trade the Iron Eyes for the sun-drenched islands of the Caribbean. It is 1,400, and you're standing on the shores of Borican, modern-day Puerto Rico, or Ayatai, Hispaniola. For the Taino people, the sea was not a barrier, it was a bridge. In the 1400s, they had transformed these islands into a densely populated, highly organized paradise, the masters of the dugout canoe. The first thing you would notice in 1400 is the canoa, the origin of our word canoe. These weren't small boats. They were ocean-going vessels carved from a single, massive ceiba tree. In 1400, some Taino canoes could carry over 100 people. They used these to navigate the turquoise highway between islands, trading gold from the rivers, exquisitely carved stone chairs, duhos, and high-quality cotton. They were master navigators, reading the language of the waves and the flight of birds to find islands over the horizon long before they could see land. The Canuco, the science of the mound. In 1400, the Taino didn't just pick fruit from trees. They were expert farmers who used a system called the Canuco. They built large, circular mounds of earth, 3 feet high and 9 feet across. Inside these mounds, they planted a mix of crops, primarily cassava, yucca, sweet potatoes, and beans. The mound prevented erosion, aerated the soil, and provided drainage during heavy tropical rains. They discovered that if you grate the cassava and squeeze out the poisonous cyanide juice using a woven sibucan, you're left with a flour that can be made into cassabe, a flatbread that stays fresh for months. In 1400, this was the space food of the Caribbean, allowing for long sea voyages. The Beatty, the sacred game. At the center of every 1400s Taino village was a large, flat plaza called the Beatty. This was the heart of social life. Here, they played a ball game that involved keeping a solid rubber ball in the air using only their hips, elbows, and shoulders. In 1400, this wasn't just a sport. It was a way to settle disputes between villages without going to war. They used a ball made from the sap of local trees, the first rubber ball humans ever created. When Europeans later saw this game, they were terrified, thinking the ball was possessed by spirits because they had never seen a material that bounced. Zemies, the presence of spirits. In 1400, the Taino world was filled with zemies. These were physical objects made of stone, wood, or shell that housed the spirits of ancestors or gods. They were often triangular or human-shaped with large, swirling eyes. The Taino believed they lived in a constant dialogue with the forces of nature. Their word for a great storm was huracan, the origin of our word hurricane. In 1400, they built their homes, bohayos, with round walls and cone-shaped roofs specifically to survive the breath of huracan. Welcome back. Today we step into the heat and humidity of the Deep South in the year 1400. You're standing in a massive, cleared plaza. Ahead of you, the earth rises in a series of giant, flat-topped pyramids. This is the capital of a chiefdom, a place of high ritual and rigid social order. While the Great Plains had its nomads, and the Southwest its cliff dwellers, the Southeast in 1400 was a land of chiefdoms, miniature kingdoms ruled by leaders who claimed they were descended from the sun itself. The architecture of the Sacred Mound. The first thing you would notice in 1400 is the sheer scale of the earthworks. Unlike the pyramids of Egypt, made of stone, or the Aztecs, made of rubble and lime, these were made of pure, hand-carried clay. At a site like Etowah, the largest mound rises over 60 feet. In 1400, The top of this mound wasn't a tomb, it was a stage. It held the house of the great sun, the chief. To the people living in the thatched houses below, the chief literally lived closer to the heavens. The sides of these mounds were often covered in colored clays, red, white, and yellow, making them look like vibrant, glowing monuments in the afternoon sun, the copper and the shell, the high art of the SECC. In 1400, the Southeast was united by a specific artistic movement that archaeologists call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. These artists were the Da Vinci's of the 1400s. They worked primarily with two materials: native copper, brought from the Great Lakes, and marine shells from the Gulf Coast. They created gorgets, large, circular shell pendants, engraved with images of birdmen, feathered serpents, and warriors holding decapitated heads. These weren't just decorations. They were ID cards that showed your rank and your relationship to the spirit world. In 1400, if you wore a copper plate embossed with a falcon man, you were a person of immense power. The chunky game, sport as diplomac. At the center of the plaza in 1400, you would see a high-stakes game called chunky. A player would roll a polished stone disc across the flat ground, and other players would throw spears to where they thought the stone would stop. This wasn't just a game. It was a way to prevent war. Disputes between neighboring towns were often settled on the chunky field. People would bet everything they owned, their tools, their jewelry, even their own labor, on the outcome of a single roll. In 1400, chunky was the national pastime that kept the peace between the Sun Kings, the Three Sisters, and the Surplus. The engine behind this grand society was, once again, the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash. But in the southeast, the soil was so rich that they produced a massive surplus. In 1400, this surplus was stored in granaries, elevated wooden buildings that were guarded by soldiers. This allowed the Sun Kings to support a class of professional artisans and priests who didn't have to farm. It was the first professional class in the American South. That's it for today. Good night.